Good evening and welcome, everybody. We're very pleased to have you here. On behalf of the Asia Society and the APNIC Foundation, welcome to this evening's seminar. My name is Duncan Macintosh. I'm the Executive Director of the APNIC Foundation. APNIC stands for the Asia Pacific Network Information Centre, but we use the acronym APNIC to describe it, so that's what we're using through the evening. We're delighted to be here. This is the first event in Hong Kong by the APNIC Foundation, which is registered as a foundation in Hong Kong. You'll hear more about APNIC shortly from one of our speakers. But first, I just wanted to say that we very much look forward to engaging with the community here in Hong Kong and all those interested in the internet. I'm very happy to meet with you afterwards. This evening we have 3 speakers, and then we'll have about 15 minutes each, and then we'll have some time for question and answers and discussions. So let me just briefly introduce our speakers. Immediately on my right is Paul Wilson, the Director General of APNIC, the Internet Numbers Registry for the Asia Pacific. Sylvia Sumarlin from Indonesia, who is a board member of APNIC Foundation, and Sharad Sanghi from India, who is also a board member of the APNIC Foundation. And as you've seen from the program, I think you've had time to read it, so I won't go into the detail and repeat it. Each of them will be talking about opportunities and challenges for the internet in Indonesia and in India. But first, I'll invite Paul to the podium to introduce in more detail APNIC and give an overview of the internet's development in the region. Thank you, Paul.
Thank you all for coming very much. My talk tonight is more about internet development, internet challenges, let's say, than opportunities. The internet in Asia is obviously a very big deal, and it's going to be a bigger deal in coming years. Not only is our region, kind of does it account for half of the world's population, but it accounts for well over half of the amount of internet development that's going on around the world at the moment. So internet development is something that's a real issue. It doesn't happen automatically. It's not a trivial thing. In fact, a lot of work is needed to make sure that where the internet is developing, it is actually going to deliver the sorts of benefits that are sort of taken for granted, actually, in a lot of markets where the internet has been endemic for quite a while. We sort of feel like, or people feel like, the internet is just something you switch it on, or you bring a cable into a Pacific Island country, and suddenly the internet flows out, and everyone's happy. But there's a great deal more to it than that, and in fact, there's a lot of there's a whole lot of dynamic that goes on that historically has sort of characterised the way the internet develops around the world, and it's quite a bunch of subtle sort of factors involved that actually come out of the origins of the internet, I think, as a very accessible bottom-up, originally an academic exercise that allowed anyone to connect to it. APNIC has been around for 20 years, 25 years. We are the Regional Internet Address Registry for the Asia Pacific. So we've been operating as a non-profit organisation since the early 1990s as the body responsible for allocating and managing IP addresses. Now, just to get a bit technical, the IP addresses are the numeric addresses that the internet requires in order to operate. Every device on the internet requires an address in order to connect, as it does quite magically, to any other device on the internet which has an address. And the management of these addresses is something that's been going on obviously since the internet started. But as the internet grew, the management which happened in the United States originally was regionalised. And so a bunch of people back in the early 90s had the opportunity to sort of put their hands up and volunteer to take on the job of internet address management for the Asia Pacific back then. And the task was sort of fairly easily given to them back at that time, when almost nobody had a clue about what was really coming or what it was all about. But in that sense, APNIC started with a very technical mission to perform this technical task, to manage IP addresses, to make allocations of blocks of IP addresses to network operators who needed them around the world. One of the reasons why, or around the region, one of the reasons why this function was regionalised back then was because actually, although the internet was very small back in the early 1990s, anyone who was around at the time using the internet would have been aware that there was even fears back then that the internet address space was going to run out, the internet would have to stop growing. And that was really just because addresses were being given away very, very liberally, very easily to anyone who asked for them. So part of what we did was we brought a new system of kind of rationally allocating, carefully managing addresses so that they would actually be available for much longer to all who needed them. And that's what we really succeeded in doing, because although people were talking about the end of the internet in the 1990s, it certainly didn't happen. Really, it had barely started then. But APNIC started, really the people who developed, who put forward the proposal for APNIC were interested in development of the internet in the region. They were, as I say, people in the early days of the internet who were largely associated with academic and research networks. And what they wanted to do was to assist in internet development in the region by bringing this function, by being able to do it in this region in accordance with regional needs and to serve the best needs of the networks in our region. And the challenge actually was that limited supply of IP addresses. So since about 1983, the internet's used something called IPv4, IP version 4. Some of you may have heard about IPv4 and IPv6. But IPv4 was the original set of protocols, and it gave room for 4 billion addresses. And that seemed an awful lot of addresses back in those days. You know, 4 billion was an unthinkable sort of number of devices for the network. But these days we've got 3 billion people on the internet, and it's estimated there are 6 times as many devices as that. So 20 billion devices are sharing a maximum of 4 billion addresses. We're at a stage now where those 4 billion addresses of IPv4 are nearly entirely allocated. But clearly they're not enough even now to properly run the internet according to its original model, which was that every device has an address. And that's why actually for the last 10 years we've been supporting a really long-term transition to a much bigger addressing space, which is IPv6, and that's the next generation with vastly larger address space, enough for the internet to grow many times larger, in fact technically millions of times larger than it is now, and that should last for 100 years or so at least. No one knows what's coming after that, so it had better last for at least as long as it takes to work out what's next. But in one way or another, APNIC has been allocating and registering these addresses and some other related resources around the Asia Pacific. We serve 56 different economies, including Hong Kong, of course, and we've been doing this as a kind of what's frankly a natural monopoly, a non-profit registry organisation that serves this community sort of exclusively. There are 4 other registries in the world that also do the same task, but we cover everything from the most developed to the least developed economies of the region, and these days we serve more than 15,000 organisations around the region. So these are, excuse me, these are the large telcos, the mid-sized ISPs, the data centres, and also the enterprises who are building networks for their own purposes. And that's what the development of the internet has brought to us in this region. And we still go on because, of course, as I said already, the internet has got so much more growth, to see over the coming years. So, just in practical terms, internet development. What does it mean? Well, the internet's a very big place, so it means all sorts of things. We have quite a specialist kind of niche product and market at APNIC. It really is the delivery of addresses to the people who are building the internet, who are building the networks. But we like to think that those who are building the networks, who are really making the internet infrastructure available for other people to then use and build on, they're critical. Without the people who are deploying IP addresses, who are deploying the networks and building and connecting devices, the internet wouldn't be here. So we really do target that sector of the quite vast internet industry in our work on internet development. And So one of the biggest demands that we have from network operators around the region, we've got to remember that the internet these days is a really highly competitive market. You know, the margins that an internet retail service provider will earn from their work, for instance, you know, a user who calls up a human being on a help desk, by using that resource from their service provider, they've kind of blown the profit margin of that user for some period of months or a year or so. The profit margins are very, very tiny. So the room to move, particularly in highly competitive and developing markets, the room to move that people have is very small. So they actually really do need help, particularly in developing markets. And what we're asked to help with is exactly how the internet infrastructure can be built in the best way, efficiently and securely. And security is really a key word these days for what people actually expect and demand and what the internet needs to deliver. They're after capacity building to help, for instance, in that transition to IPv6. And that's one of the things that our stakeholders are very much demanding. So, for instance, just a month ago, we had a couple of APNIC trainers who travelled 60 hours actually to reach one of the remotest locations in the Pacific, the island of Tokelau, which is the world's smallest economy, to provide training and technical assistance to get network operators there to understand what was needed in planning for IPv6 deployment. Now, that's not a commercial opportunity, mind you, to go and do that. It's something that's actually required to assist that country to actually make a move that they wouldn't be making without that assistance. And that's just one very small example. The thing is, Tokelau by 2020 will benefit from a big upgrade to their connectivity. They'll have a huge submarine cable coming by and reaching their atolls. It's optimistically, it's a great thing for the island, for 1,500 people. But again, to be more realistic than optimistic, there's a lot more to actually providing that connectivity to those people than, as I say, just dropping the cable on the beach, because it's actually not just about doing that. It's not about the hardware only. It's about the people who are actually going to build and operate that network and do it securely and do it in a way, for instance, at the policy level that delivers the services that people actually need in order to become internet citizens, and that doesn't happen automatically. The simple fact of the matter is that the difference wherever you go between a set of internet services that work, that are secure and stable and that you can rely on, that deliver you bandwidth and security, the difference between that ideal situation and something that's less ideal is mostly just in the capacity of the human beings who are actually doing that work. So it's largely these days, of course, a private sector activity, but it's still one that in competitive markets needs some real leadership and support to have it actually operate and do what we all expect it to do. And one of the problems there is the supply of human capacity and expertise. The internet company Cisco performed a study a while ago that said that in 2016 they estimated a skills gap of about 27%, and that equated to literally hundreds of thousands of engineers, of qualified engineers, needing to be available within those years, in the coming years, to actually do the job that needs to be done. And this is at a time when everyone's raving about the internet, where governments are saying the internet needs to be delivered to their citizens, and there's a huge gap between the sort of expectation and the promise and what can actually be delivered, particularly, as I say, when security is more and more not just a threat to individuals, but it's a threat to nations, to companies, to governments, and so on. And so at APNIC we see very clear indicators of these skills shortages. We have our members continually demanding and needing training. They can't easily get it from anywhere. Good quality, up-to-date, best practices training. And the other increasing concern is cybersecurity. So something APNIC does as a membership organisation is we survey our region, our entire sort of stakeholder group every couple of years, and we work out what the challenges are. So up until about 4 years ago, the challenges were certain things like IPv6, for instance. That's a challenge that has been on people's minds for many years now. But these days, security is the biggest challenge. I think we all know why that is. So APNIC's been working for 20 years now, helping internet development as best we can, and particularly, as I say, in this area of capacity building. We've probably trained tens of thousands of engineers who have helped to build networks and build the networks that perhaps some of you are actually relying on these days. We run conferences which bring professionals together so that they can network in a human sense with each other. Supporting other initiatives like parts of the infrastructure like internet exchange points, which allow internet service providers within one country to exchange traffic without having it flowing out of the country and back in again when they don't have an exchange point. There are other factors, particularly in, or other pieces of infrastructure, particularly in security as well, that we contribute to. And we've been thinking for a long time, actually, while APNIC has expanded, we're a staff of 80 now in Brisbane in Australia. We've consistently, for the last 20 years, spent about 20% of our budget on assisting internet development as a non-profit agency, but really taking our membership funds and contributing them to the good of the internet more broadly than just our membership. And we've been thinking for quite a long time about how, because we keep getting asked, how we can deliver more without asking our members, mostly private organisations, to fork out more of their own funds. And so the idea came about to establish the APNIC Foundation as effectively a fundraising arm for APNIC to continue our work. So the foundation's based here in Hong Kong, as you've heard. We've just had our first year of operation and managed to raise nearly $1 million of funding to help with various projects that we've been undertaking in all of these areas. So really, it's a sort of a niche approach. It's not something that many people would hear about, not let alone IP addressing itself, which is a sort of highly technical area. But even this challenge, the fact that something we rely on can actually be kind of really dependent on just the skills of operators. You know, it's not an automatic system. It's not something that you buy off the shelf or that just runs automatically. It's something that actually needs a huge amount of human resource, and particularly in our region, which is growing and under so much growth strength. The internet can only be as good as the people who are operating it, and as good as the human capacity of those people to do that job. And that's why we're here, and that's why I hope that if any of you are in a position to take a look at what the foundation is doing and to find a way to support it for internet development in the Asia Pacific, then you might consider that, because that's the internet is something that is bringing social and economic progress to all of us, and it's something that at APNIC at least we want to make sure is shared around our entire region. So thanks very much for your time. You'll hear more details yet on at least two of our economies, our biggest and most important economies, India and Indonesia, coming up. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Paul. Just a quick plug for those who've not already. If you'd like to read more about the foundation, there is that brochure out in the registration table. Please pick one up before you go home. So, as Paul mentioned, and you've seen the program, we'd like now, we've got a great opportunity to learn more about the opportunities and the challenges facing the internet in Indonesia. So I'd like to invite Sylvia Sumarlin to give her presentation.
Now, everybody know that Indonesia is huge in terms of population. And before I go into the details about what is the picture of the internet society over there and how people behave toward the use of technology and use of internet, I'll give just a brief background on what is Indonesia itself. I mean, Indonesia is a country with a population 260 million. The median age is about 29 years old. And there are like 300 distinct ethnic groups, about 700 different languages, linguistics, I guess. And it's during rainy seasons, there are about 17,000 islands, but during dry season, it's about 21,000 islands. So it depends on when you ask me, is it rainy seasons or dry seasons, and I'll give you the answer. Most populated Muslims in the world. If that means anything, it means that it influences the behavior of the Indonesian population and people. 40% of its population live in Java. There are 5 big islands in Indonesia. One of them is Java, and 40% of the population is in that island. And the main industry is palm oil, petroleum, natural gas, mining, things like that. Now, our president, his name is Joko Widodo, and we call him Jokowi. Now, Jokowi has a plan. When he became into office, he stated that, okay, I'm the president. I have to make sure that everybody knows what my goal is. And he said that for me to be as a president, I will do 3 major things. One is political stability, utilizing media for public information. So he's into technology. And then he says that skills development and improvement, the nation must be competitive in region. That means that in terms of skill improvement, he's also focusing in digital skills improvement. And also economic-driven factors, which is the infrastructures, the fixed infrastructure, physical, and also digital infrastructure. That's what he's focusing on from the early days when he just entered presidency. Then he came up with an initiative. There is the 15th package of economic reform, mainly focusing into the development of investment, making an investment climate very favorable, and he also focusing in agriculture, and then connectivity. Now, in terms of connectivity, we move on to the infrastructure development, specifically the physical and the communication infrastructure. And then the third things that, because of things happening in the past with terrorism, he is very much concerned with the act of terrorism, and so he established this counter-terrorism unit. January 2018, the beginning of the year, he established an agency called the National Cyber and Encryptions Agency. Basically, it's a counter-terrorism unit. And I happen to be one of the person having an MOU with this agency, providing cybersecurity training. Now, he says that infrastructure is important. And he says that, okay, in terms of infrastructures, I will focus on railroad. The target is 3,258 kilometers, but then it's 388.3 until today that's been realized. So it's until 2017, so there's still more development to do. Bus transit is like that also. I'm skipping airports. 15 airports to be built. He already met halfway, which is 7 airports. Crossing harbor, his new plan is initiating the sea toll system for the seaport. And that helps a lot because it's reducing the cost of transportation during the sea. We've got so many islands, and therefore it's important that the transportation is for between islands is established. It used to be the prices of gasoline in Papua compared to Java. It's like 10 times price differences, and it's a huge difference. But now today, if you go to Papua, then the price is actually the same. And the way that he built the infrastructure, it's kind of interesting, that he commissioned the military, the army, specifically to build the roads from north to south to north, or north to south, east to west. And it was the military who were commissioned to do that, and successfully done so. So now we're looking at prices in Papua and in Java, similar. It's about similar. Now we're talking about the internet society. Out of 262 million of people, the internet users is already 143.26 million. 143 people connected to the internet. And we'll see that those who are the internet users, mainly 72% of it resides in the city. So the people in the urban area have more chances to be connected to the internet. And then the small town is about 50%. And then if we're talking about rural, it's also another 40% of the people living in rural that can get connected. The reason being is that infrastructure, again, the communication infrastructure, meaning the fiber optics, the wireless, the satellite, they are not reaching the small town and the rural. And number two is the cost of getting connected to internet becomes a challenge for people who are living in small town and in the rural area. Now, in terms of gender, it's about 50-50, 48.57% and 51.43%. So there's not much difference between male and female. Now, in terms of users based on age group, we're looking at 13 to 18 years old, about 16%, 19 to 34 years old, 49%, 35 to 54 years old, 29%, and above 54 years old, about 4.24%. But you combine 19 until 54 years old, it's almost 80% who are connected to the internet. This means that, yeah, we've got our generation nowadays, that there are many more people connected to the internet, more information can be disseminated, and then people would think that, oh, that's good, because then you're going to have population bonus, meaning that the young age demographic bonus. That's not necessarily the case, because then these numbers only showed the people that are connecting to the internet, but not the quality of people connecting to the internet. What I'm saying is that Indonesia, there is still high infant mortality rate, even though it's not high, but it's still there. And then the quality of food, quality of living are still really not there yet, not compared to the developed country. So the people that were there, even though they're connecting, you think that, oh, it's good that they're connected. It's good that then that means that education can be disseminated. No, not really. We have to take a look at what are people using the internet for. Then we go to the next one. So internet is correlated to the level of education. The higher people get educated, the more people in that education group get connected to the internet. So if you have no education, among of those people who do not have education, then there are only about 5% of people who are connected to the internet. As opposed to those who are in the postgraduate level, there are like huge pool of people in the postgraduates are connected to the internet. Internet users based on economic status. Of course, because of the pricing, because of the availability, mostly in the cities, then we're looking at, okay, people with high income. I don't know what high income says. I mean, but high income people, they have 74.62% are connected to the internet, are using the internet. Whereas the low income, they can't afford internet connection. They're not even have the facility to have access. Then it's only 1.98%, only 2%. Whereas the middle income and the upper middle income, still low percentage of connecting. So we really see only the elite ones that are connected to the internet. Now, types of devices. How do people get connected, right? Those who own smartphones and tablets, 50% of them use it for internet. And those who computers or laptops, there's only 25% are connecting to the internet. Smartphones, this is the number of smartphone users. You know, it's not the users, but the issuance of the SIM cards is about 300 million. You know, the population is only 262, but the SIM cards issuance is about 300 millions. And that's probably because one person might have more devices, more smartphones to get the connections. Now, internet penetration, apps acquisition. People in my country, they don't want to pay for apps. I mean, free apps is heaven. Paying, and so they said that, okay, apps purchase, if you have to purchase, only 11.41% will purchase an app. Even if they need it, it's only 11.41%. Now, to subscribe, if you have to subscribe for anything, only 6% of the people, internet users, will subscribe. even if it says that, okay, you're going to a certain college, you have to subscribe to this portal to get access for your material, things like that, they just walk away. No way. You know, they would rather share subscription. That's what I'm saying. So in one class, one people will get subscription, everybody will share it together, and that's how it is right now. So if you go into Indonesia, you promote your apps, you're selling your apps, that's a challenge. But if you go to Indonesia, you have very good apps and you want to get the volumes, free people using it, Indonesia is the right place to do it. You know, you will get massive of people trying your app. Are they going to be loyal to you? Not necessarily. But see, okay. Smartphones. How many people have one unit of smartphone? At least, most people will at least have one unit smartphone and one unit computer. Now, having 2 units, the percentage is less because devices are quite expensive, and they just buy. They only rely on one smartphone, one computer in each category. Fixed line. Now, if you see the number earlier, that the cities, the high-income people, they get connected more. That's because of this. Fixed line, connecting islands, 17,000 islands are quite the challenge. Having submarine cables from one island to another island, this has become even more challenging. And satellite is so expensive. So people who could get good quality of internet in Indonesia using the fixed line, they are the one who can really afford it. So most people will consider that it's still expensive. Some people say, oh, it's normal. But many people will say normal, the ones that are connected. Cheap, only 22%. For mobile apps, people say it's still expensive, it's only 23%. Most people get connected to the mobile application through their smartphones. They say that the price is normal, 56.77%. Cheap, they consider it's quite cheap. Users' awareness on security breach. People are aware of the possibility of their data and identity being stolen. What's the awareness? Most people, they are aware, 65.98%. How about fraud? They're aware of being a fraud, 83.98%. And the thing about Indonesia is that there are lots of people that are very curious, especially youngsters. And so they've got this community of hackers, and they call themselves the red hat, the blue hat, following the standard, you know, which is actually, what is that? They have communities of that. I can share you one story, which is quite funny. One day, one of the military guy in high position called me up and said, Sylvia, you know, can you just please help me trace the guy who is hacking our system? And I said, what's going on? And they're changing the website. They're defacing the website. And we need to get to know, really need to know who is doing it. So then we started tracing this person. And it happened to be, we thought when we first got this case, we thought it was going to be in big cities like Jakarta, Surabaya, Bandung. No, it's in a remote place in Borneo Island. Not even in the city in Borneo. It's even in the village of Borneo. And so we were able to capture the face because this guy apparently was still hacking the same thing, sitting right in front of the computer, you know, facing the camera. So we remotely turned on the camera, got this guy, it's a guy's face, and we were like, ooh, very shocked. You know, it was a very young guy, about 10 years old, 10 to 11, hacking he didn't intentionally hack the high security thing. He didn't even know about that. And we were like, ooh, are we going to put this guy in jail, or what are we going to do about it? So then he was being processed, and it turned out to be this guy in this remote village, you know. He was sitting in front of a computer, not alone, by the way, even though in front of the camera it looks like he was alone. It turns out to be he's got peers surrounding him and telling him, you know, you got to do this if you want to be inducted into our group. So it's a group of hackers living in Borneo. Okay, I'll just do it quick. Antivirus, do they think it's very important? Most people think it's important to protect their data. Very important in that sense. So this is just a picture of how the internet society or internet people behave in Indonesia. I'm ending my presentation, and so if there's any questions and answer later. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sylvia. For our last presentation, I'd like to invite Sharad Sanghi to talk about the opportunities and challenges for the internet in Indonesia. Thank you, Sharad.
India.
Sorry, excuse me.
Sorry, it's okay. Yeah. So I'll start with a few statistics, not as elaborate as Sylvia's, but a few statistics, and then maybe spend more time discussing certain challenges and opportunities, and happy to take any questions. And if there's something I've not covered and you would like me to cover, because I was given a limited time, I'll be happy to answer. So India is likely to be a 5 trillion economy by 2025. Of course, our current Prime Minister wants to accelerate that, but as per OECD, we are supposed to be a 5 trillion economy by 2025. We are already in, I think we're probably 6 right now, and we'll be 5 by 2020 and 4 by 2025. In terms of connectivity stats, so Sylvia, we have 1 billion more people than Indonesia. You have 260, I think we are 1.3 if I'm not mistaken. And telephone subscribers are 1.2 billion, and teledensity is 93.61. And while the total broadband subscribers is 362 million, but the total internet users are 462 million. Now, this could be either because you have sharing, more people using, or it could just be the way it's being classified because they're 2 different data sources. So yeah, 460 million internet users, 1.3 billion population. Penetration from a percentage perspective is still low, and I'll cover that as one of the challenges later. And from a worldwide perspective, pretty significant. I think we'll be like 460 out of 4.1, right? And in terms of, we are the second largest, in terms of number of people, not in terms of percentage penetration, but in terms of number of people. I think 770 million in China, and then 462 million in India, which is more than the population, I think, of the United States. Look at the growth of internet users in India. You see a pretty, standard. I think most countries will see this kind of a growth. In 2007, we are right around 2018, so it's about 462 million. 77% of urban users, and 92% of rural users consider mobile as their primary device for whoever accesses. Obviously, like in Indonesia, in India also, the penetration in rural areas is much lower. But most people, the primary medium to access internet is the mobile phone. The rural India user base is about 132 million, and urban India is about 313 million. There are over 320 million smartphone owners in 2018. And we had recently, and I'll cover this in a couple of slides because it had a huge impact, 4G was launched by a provider called Reliance Geo recently, about 1.5 years back. And that has, they announced very high speeds at very low cost. For almost a year, they were trialing, or several months, they were trialing out their service, and they gave it free. And then they bundled smartphones that they locally kind of developed in collaboration with some of the larger companies, literally gave phones for a small deposit, and they gave that much worth of data access free. So that totally changed the dynamics of how this went about and disrupted the whole market. So in terms of WhatsApp has over 200 million active users. Facebook has over 184 million active users in India, and YouTube has more than 180 million active users. And almost the CEOs of all these global companies have visited India in the last year or so. right? They've also set up data centers in India, and some of the Google has announced and already set up several Wi-Fi spots across 400 stations in India. Facebook tried to do something called Free Basic, but that got shelved because of net neutrality issues. And Google launched this Internet Saathi program to educate women on how to use smartphone, and particularly in rural areas. E-commerce is a great, has now matured in India as well, and it's supposed to be a $200 billion industry by 2026. Some of obviously the key growth drivers being very similar, but in India, especially the tier 2, tier 3 cities and rural cities don't have access to, it's not as easy to access goods. And so, that has really, especially tier 2 cities, you've seen huge growth of e-commerce in them. Huge record private equity and venture capital investments in the e-commerce space, 11 billion till the first half of 2017. A lot of people were getting worried because most of these companies were losing money big time. But just about 2 weeks back, Walmart acquired Flipkart, India's largest e-commerce company, for over, I think they valued them at 20 billion and invested 16 billion in them. And and basically now there's a consolidation in the space. There's basically Amazon and Walmart now, the two lead competitors in India from an e-commerce perspective. Digital payments is another thing that's now growing. I think there was this, I would say controversial, I wouldn't say either pro or con, but there was a huge initiative by the government in 2016 to do what is known as demonetization, where 86% of our currency was overnight rendered useless, and fresh currency was then introduced. And in that process, a lot of that gave a huge spurt to digital payments and a cashless economy. And we see some of the numbers are here. I think there's still a long way to go. There's only 4.5% of India's consumption is through digital payments, and 70% orders are cash on delivery. So that's a challenge that the e-commerce industry in India faces, because a lot of people buy stuff, they don't want to use credit cards, and so when you deliver the equipment, deliver the goods home, a lot of people reject it if they don't like it, and things like that. So that's a challenge, a lot of returns that happen. I think the government has played a very critical role in enabling digital payments. There's the UPI interface, instant transfer of money between bank accounts with mobile numbers. $600 million transacted in 3 months, December 16 to, this is during the post-demonetization, immediately after demonetization. And now WhatsApp has also built a UPI interface, and so there are some successful companies like Paytm that has got investment from Alibaba, but there are also free applications like WhatsApp that is now UPI enabled. There was this Jan Dhan Yojana scheme, which is Jan Dhan Yojana means where the government could provide subsidies and direct deposits to bank accounts. So now almost all Indians have a unique identifier known as Aadhaar, and that is now almost like your identity, and that is that's how you need that to even create your bank account. And now that there is a way to verify that you're genuine, because earlier a lot of the subsidies that the government would provide went to wrong people, went to fake people. That didn't exist. So now with this more reliable mechanism, they're doing a lot of Jan Dhan scheme. So not only bank accounts, but they've also transferred money and subsidies to the poorer people using that. And several other, including the Bharat QR. I won't go into details, but this is some of the digital initiatives. There's a whole program called Digital India that the government has launched. And there's also another program called Startup India. There's a program called Skill India. And so all these kind of converge in promoting this in India. I just talk quickly about Geo. Recently I mentioned that there's a service provider called Reliance Geo that launched services. They gave data very, very cheap. In fact, for a few months it was free. And faster, using 4G LTE, their connectivity was much faster than typical broadband connections in India. Although they were called broadband, they were not really delivering broadband. What this did, now, one can argue whether they're making money, and a lot of other providers are complaining. For example, the largest provider in India, Bharti Airtel, reported their first loss ever last quarter. And it's also resulted in a lot of consolidation of telecom providers, where you, for example, have Vodafone and Idea merging, you have Airtel and you have Reliance. Pretty much these are going to be the three providers going forward. And but what it did is it forced other providers also to give similar packages. So data rates have really come down, and it also generally the competition has made even the reliability, because people won't stay with the provider if it's not reliable. There was, of course, I think that it was so successful. I think they reached some 50 million in 3 months. One more thing about this provider, for those who are interested, I know Paul mentioned about IPv4 and IPv6. 90% of the IP addresses used by Reliance Geo is IPv6. So they're the largest IPv6 provider in India, probably the only one really using IPv6 in production to this extent. Average revenue per user has gone down by 10% almost, and teledensity increased to 170% from 152%, and that 170% is, to your point, Sylvia, where it's more than one device per user. Now, I'll also, since I run data centers, I think I'll just share a little bit about data center infrastructure in India as well. So the data center market size is valued at around 2.2 billion currently, and expected to double by the end of this year. Oh, I think it should be 2020, I think. So I think they're currently at 2.2 billion. Concentration is 84% of the country's data center supply is in the major metros. So Mumbai has almost, I would say, more than 50% of the data center market. You have all the large players, including the global cloud providers like Amazon, Google, Microsoft, present in India locally. So they have availability zones of their large cloud offerings there. And the power being most reliable in Mumbai, that's where and connectivity, because it's also a landing point for international fiber. So India has 2 landing points, Mumbai and Chennai. They're 2 main landing points. And so these are naturally places where a lot of these providers put their data centers. The key drivers are growth in data, intelligent devices, and of course everything, applications all moving to the cloud. So you need that to be hosted somewhere. Data sovereignty is something that I think is big in Indonesia, is also very big now in India, where critical data like your health records, your banking data, now the government is one by one, all the various government bodies are mandating that reside in India. So critical data is, some of it is already mandated and some of it is getting mandated to be hosted in India. So a lot of when we started this business in the late 98, early 2000, most of Indian content was overseas, like in the US and other places. Now it's the other way around. Everything now mostly, and you have world-class infrastructure now. So people don't, when some of these global customers come to India, the content providers, and they see the kind of infrastructure, they're quite amazed. So at least in the major metros, infrastructure is pretty high quality, and the similar SLAs that you would get anywhere in the world is offered in India as well. Now we'll discuss a little bit about challenges and opportunities. So one of the biggest issues is security. A lot of lot of challenges. I think a lot of people, while the awareness might be there that something can go wrong, so that obviously prevents a lot of people from maybe doing digital transactions, for example. But also there's a lot of, while there may be awareness that there is risk, but there is not enough awareness on how to deal with that, how to prevent security attacks. There's not enough awareness on how to react to attacks. And we've had our own share of breaches, probably not as big or as impactful so far as what you've seen in the West, where entire elections now they're saying might have got influenced by a Russian cyber attack, or one doesn't know what the real thing is there, but that's the hypothesis. Or not as big as some of the banks, or Yahoo having 500 million plus users, data getting leaked, Facebook, etc. So it's not yet. I don't think there's been a case as high profile as that. There are government websites getting defaced all the time, and there are other issues. But I think it'll probably take a really large incident for the awareness to improve even further. India is also tracking the GDPR, the data privacy issue, which is going to happen on 25th May, I think, in Europe. I think India wants to do something similar too, and obviously that's a little worrisome because if you don't have if you're not sure how to do it. So I think it's consultative process right now. It's not yet. I don't think it's been final. There's a consultation paper that various bodies like the regulators and all have put out, but it's still not been made law. So on the urban side, we still now this has been addressed to quite extent because of the impact of Geo, but in general, the broadband speeds in India available were much lower than what you would see in a more developed market like the US or Europe. But I think that's now improving with 4G getting rolled out. There was also an issue of spectrum availability, but now that's a lot of the new spectrum has been given. And also some of the defense spectrum is being released by the government. And I think today they just announced that they're going to allocate $2 billion to the defense to give them an alternate network and use that spectrum to increase the connectivity, to improve the bandwidth that providers get. On the rural side, poor access, even though government is extending fiber connectivity, it's still quite poor because it's not as lucrative for service providers. And so rural India is still lagging behind as far as connectivity goes. And I think one of the big issues on the rural side is also the localization. There's a very small percentage of population that speaks English in the overall scheme of things. And largely the internet in India is in English, right? It's not like I've seen in many other countries, Japan, Korea, I'm pretty sure in Indonesia. I don't think we have done as good a job in localization and having content available in all the local languages. So that's one of the challenges that we need to overcome. I think that's pretty much it. Some of the opportunities the government aims to train 400 million people in digital skills. So workforce skilling of workforce is, I think, a great opportunity for us because that can unleash a huge amount of talent. Even the Indian population average age is, I think, may not be 29, maybe I think 30. I'm not sure. It's like but it's a young population. Healthcare in the 2018-19 budget, there was a healthcare initiative announced which will impact over 500 million Indians, and a lot of that will, a lot of initiatives will be through the internet. But this is more on insurance, but also there are a lot of measures announced where things like telemedicine and all will be also popularized. Resource management, like the water grid management, will enable citizens to have access to an optimum amount of water every day. And of course, there's another opportunity on Startup Hub with the Startup India initiative and a lot of other initiatives. India has the third largest startup ecosystem in the world. After maybe the US, and I'm not sure who's second, but we are probably the third largest in the world. So I think that's a huge opportunity as well, because a lot of innovation done by startups. Not only the Me Too category, which is something that succeeds in the US, and you do something similar with customization in India, but also a lot of new initiatives that the startups are doing. So I think that will all help in the development of internet in India. I think that's all I had in my presentation. Happy to take any questions, maybe along with it.
Thank you very much, Sharad. I'm looking at our host just to check if we've got a few minutes, 5 minutes for questions. So yes, the signal is yes, we have time for some questions. So I'd like to ask each person to just introduce themselves and have a brief question. We'll take, say, a couple first off. So, sorry, to the gentleman just in the blue shirt, and then the gentleman in the front in the jacket, please.
Good evening. My name's Benjamin Woodcliffe. I work for a company called Control Risks. we're working with a lot of clients who are asking about cyber sovereignty and things like China's cybersecurity law. And I know the FT's recently published a piece on this. I was wondering what the panelists think of the impact of cyber sovereignty on the development of the internet-based economies would be, and whether they see it as something which is actually going to significantly hinder growth, or how it impacts their view on it.
And I've just one more question in the front here with the gentleman in the jacket, and then we'll come to the panel. So, question on cyber sovereignty and.
Yeah, my name is Fermin Fauch. I'm with EIG International Gateway. We're based in Singapore, but we operate in Southeast Asia. And my question is, how do you guys see the future growth of the internet in terms of the mix between mobile and fixed? A lot of countries, including Indonesia and India, are also rolling FTTH, fixed networks, and fiber. But how do you see? Because normally a lot of the growth, in particular in very large countries like your countries, have been driven through mobile.
Thank you. So cyber sovereignty first. Sharad,
so when you say cyber sovereignty, are you referring to data sovereignties? The data, yeah, data sovereignty. Yeah, okay. So so I have a slightly different view. I think from a government perspective, they need to be able to. The government feels it needs to be able to regulate. And for example, somebody doing something potentially anti-national or something that causes any risk to the country, they should be able to go and shut down the server or take action. That's their perspective. I personally believe that so even though I'm in the business and it benefits us, I'm not a big fan of data sovereignty. I believe it should be, there are other ways of maybe doing that by cooperation and also let the best man win. So you should use those. Let's say if AWS provides better service, now they also do it in India, but I'm saying if they provide better service elsewhere before they were in India, that's fine to use them. And so, so I'm not a big fan of it personally, but I can see where the government is going. Will it hinder? I don't think it has really impacted, because I think some of these companies have been the global multinationals who, maybe for smaller entrepreneurs in other countries to reach countries like India may be more expensive, I guess, and so one could argue that it might lead to, but for some of the larger players, it's not an issue. I mean, they seem to be doing it. They've all opened infrastructure in the country, and for the larger players, they are doing it not only for the data sovereignty issues, they're also doing it for latency issues. So they want to be closer to the customer. So I'm not sure how big the impact is, but I'm personally not a fan of mandating something in your own country.
Sylvia, do you want to respond to that, or the mobile versus fixed?
Okay, just a quick response. In Indonesia, there's a law in terms of data sovereignty that any services done in Indonesia and collects citizens' data, then it should be mandatory that the data center should be used in Indonesia. But then it's going to be changed in a way that the new rules, the new regulation will say that only the sensitive or strategic data, a highly sensitive one, is that is supposed to be residing in Indonesia. Others, then that's okay. But it's not in effect right now. But if I say it's not in effect, the fact is it's not that way either, because for the Asian Games, coming at Asian Games in August, we're using cloud services. And cloud services by Azure, Microsoft Azure, and all the data is actually in Singapore. So even though there's that law, but then the government still think that if there is an urgency or higher needs to be in the cloud elsewhere, then they will allow that.
So Paul, would you?
Yeah, aside from the governmental issue of legislation in favour of private citizens or companies, there's also the consumer issue. I mean, as an organisation, as a company wanting to look after your own data, it may well be in your interest to have that data located in your own jurisdiction, so that it's subject to your own legislation and so forth. And that is starting to become possible. I mean, when cloud computing, so-called, was first sort of popularised, everyone seemed to believe that information was in the cloud and no one really knew where it was. But you can be sure that the service provider knew exactly where it was because it was able to get it for you, right? So there are some providers that are actually allowing you to put your own data as a customer of that CDN, to put your own data in a particular jurisdiction, and that's a very good thing. But it's a customer service and competitive issue that CDNs are more and more having to do that just to satisfy customer need. So it's a great example actually of the competitive internet being able to sort of adapt itself to customer needs.
Fixed versus mobile. Any thoughts on that, Sharad? How's it going in India?
I think in India, mobile is the primary model, and even though in metros, the same provider, like for example, Geo is doing fiber to the home, and that will also grow, but I don't think it'll match the penetration of mobile. So I think mobile will still be the primary way. In fact, there was one of the largest e-tailers or e-commerce companies, Flipkart, that got acquired a year or two back. One of the subsidiaries stopped doing desktop. They only had mobile app, right? And then they realized that was not a very smart move. They changed back to have both, so that you can access it from your laptop as well as your mobile. It's not only through the app, but also through the web browser. And but largely, but the reason they took that step is they found that 70 or 80% of the traffic was coming from the mobile, and the cost to maintain the kind of server infrastructure for the browser-based thing was maybe not worth it. So that's why they tried that out. Of course, they then changed back, but I think still the odds are that mobile will be much more than. My take is that mobile will be much more than fixed.
Indonesia, currently, internet penetration comes from mobile. But according to the government's view, that the eastern part of Indonesia are not being served by mobile nor by fixed line yet. So what's happening that our president's initiative is that for the eastern region, it should be fixed line. So that because mobile operators do not want to go into the eastern part of Indonesia because of forests, things like that. And it's difficult terrain for the operators to invest in the eastern part. So the government invests in the eastern part, and the way they invest into the fixed line, along with developing the infrastructure altogether.
There's an interesting repeat happening now of what happened in the early 1990s with voice. Because if you tried, as I did back then in a number of developing countries, to promote the use of a modem, you'd find that no one had a copper line at all, and they in fact were waiting 24 months to even have a line installed and paying thousands of dollars. Then just a few short years later, everyone had voice mobile phones, and the number of mobile accounts or subscriptions just skyrocketed. And that's exactly the same phenomenon with fixed broadband versus mobile. There's a few interesting things that are happening now, though. I mean, there are spectrum issues. The crowded spectrum that exists now that is required to be liberated for more mobile devices. That's a policy issue that governments need to deal with. But there's also more flexibility in that one of these devices can be just as useful on a Wi-Fi network as on an LTE network. So there is the phenomenon of the community network where you can use what are effectively very cheap versions of telco infrastructure that's actually more like your domestic hotspot infrastructure to create local hotspots of internet access. And providing you've got the trunk connection somewhere to get to the upstream to the internet, then that can be a very, very cheap and effective way to provide perfectly good and in fact quite high bandwidth connectivity. And there's quite a bit of investment that goes into that, but of course the risk in that area is that when a telco marches in and plonks a mobile phone tower into your community, it could wipe out the existing community network activities that have been going on. But that again is kind of the beauty of the open and competitive internet, that a kid literally can go and buy off-the-shelf gear and sort of connect their village to the internet if they've got the the motivation and a bit of knowledge to do that. So that's all in the mobile space, which can be Wi-Fi, it can be LTE, as well as as alternatives to the fixed line mobile, fixed line broadband.
I think we've got time for just one last round of questions. Yep, sure.
Can you briefly describe the competition landscape of the two countries, and is there any policies to induce or facilitate competition from the government?
So competition in terms of internet service providers, or
internet service, telecom service, mobile, and are there many operators? What is the biggest operator's market share?
Sure. So the government. So I'll take each of them. So whether it's internet services require a license. It's an ISP license, and it's a much cheaper license than if you want to do voice and what is known as national long distance and international long distance licenses. There's a revenue share with the government. I think it's roughly 8% of your revenue. And in terms of competition on the telcos, there were many providers earlier, and there was this. But then with Geo coming, and for other reasons, there was a consolidation that had happened in the industry, and so now there are largely three large providers. As I said, Vodafone and Idea merged into one. Or are in the process of merging. There's Bharti Airtel and there's Reliance Geo. There are some other small providers, but they will all get gobbled up with one of these three. I mean, the general consensus is that there will be these three large guys on the telco side. ISPs, there are many more, but there are three categories of ISPs. There's Class A, which is national, Class B, which is in a particular large city like a metro, and Class C, which is in a tier 2 or tier 3. I don't remember the statistics, but there are over 100 active internet service providers. They connect through internet exchange called NIXI, which is National Internet Exchange of India, but now there are many smaller private exchanges that are coming. The NIXI is funded by the Ministry of Information Technology, and then so mobile, and so those are the so basically you need licenses for both, but anybody can take a license and do it. So there's not it's free. I mean, it's open to everyone to provide services. It's not, they don't restrict the number of licenses. So it's actually from that perspective, it's fairly straightforward.
Okay, Indonesia, in 1995 there were like only 5 licenses. Now 2018 there are about 300 ISP licenses. The government is now restricting the people who wants to get the license, ISP license, because of the many people, many ISP companies, they're competing in the same city. Even though they get the national license, they hardly go to the remote area. They're competing in the same city, and so the competition is very, very rough, I guess. For the operators, mobile operators, used to be 11. They're consolidating. Maybe now it's only 5 big ones from 11 mobile operator. And I don't see that it's going to grow to a new number. I think it's going to stay at that number for a while.
Thank you, and thank you very much for the questions. That brings an end to this evening's program. Let me start by thanking our very gracious hosts from the Asia Society. If you're not yet a member and you've enjoyed the facilities this evening, I really strongly urge you to consider membership of the Asia Society. It has great events, and as you can appreciate, a great venue for it. Let me also thank Sharad, Sylvia and Paul, the panelists. Please join me in thanking them one last time for the seminars. And of course, a sincere thanks to all of you for turning out tonight. I hope you enjoyed the program, and we'll see you again in another internet-related program brought to you by the APNIC Foundation. Thank you very much.